Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're continuing on with the dismantled evolution video from Genesis Apologetics channel, because working on two series simultaneously is always a good idea, am I right? Last time we dealt with molecular clock dating, where we learned that one specific type of molecular clock dating gives anomalous results, therefore the anomalous one must be the correct one, because reasons. Let's see what they come up with next. This video is brought to you by the upcoming Bart Ehrman vs. Mike Licona debate. Visit vicerhino.com/Bart or listen to the end of the video for more information.
While the actual genetic data reveals a single mitochondrial Eve ancestor and a single Y chromosome ancestor, evolutionists have insisted they must have lived in a larger population.
Yes, you make it sound like that's supposed to be odd. Well, think of it this way. You and your siblings all presumably share the same mother, but your mother was not the only human woman on the planet when she had you. Even though you and all your brothers and sisters can trace your lineage back to this single woman, it does not make her the only woman in existence. Expand it out to your first cousins, and you can all trace your lineage back to one grandmother. And this grandmother was not the only woman in existence. Keep expanding it out, and when you include the whole human race, it turns out that we can all trace our lineage back to one mitochondrial ancestor who lived about 99 to 148,000 years ago, and a Y chromosome ancestor who lived about 2 to 300,000 years ago.
For this reason, they caution the general public not to mistake the evolutionary Adam and Eve with Adam and Eve of the Bible.
Yeah, because they're not the same thing, like not even a little bit.
Yet they acknowledge there can be no direct evidence for the larger population size of 10,000 because all other mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages supposedly died off.
As I mentioned previously, I haven't actually found anything that puts the number of the population at 10,000. I mean, certainly there have been estimates that humanity faced at least one bottleneck event in the past 100,000 years that reduced the population down to between 1 to 10,000 breeding pairs, but that research is largely unrelated to the mitochondrial or Y chromosome common ancestor research.
Removing all traces of their existence, leaving, as paleo expert Chris Stringer has said, just one lucky mother and one lucky father.
I actually can't find any evidence of Chris Stringer having said that. What I did find was a Newsweek article originally published in 1988 in which Alan Wilson, the biologist who first demonstrated the possibility of a molecular clock, who, in reference to the fact that anyone familiar with both statistics and how genetic inheritance works wouldn't be surprised by the existence of a mitochondrial common ancestor, stated that there must be one lucky mother. And then immediately followed that up with, I worry about the term Eve a little bit because of the implication that in her generation there were only two people. We are not saying that. We're saying that in her generation there was some unknown number of men and women, probably a fairly large number, maybe a few thousand. I feel like this is probably one of those quotes that has passed through so many creationists' hands without anyone checking the original source that at some point the attribution got mixed up and none of them noticed.
In an attempt to explain what would otherwise be another remarkable biblical coincidence, proponents of the ape-to-man model invoke what is known as coalescent theory.
Coalescent theory, to oversimplify, is when you study an allele in multiple populations where both populations got that allele from a common ancestor. This is most definitely related to mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, but it is much broader than just them specifically. It essentially will allow you to find the common ancestor of any specific allele, and when done correctly can help glean information about the time in which that common ancestor lived. Information such as population size estimates. So maybe this is where they're getting the population size of 10,000 individuals?
This theory assumes that over many generations, it is inevitable that eventually only a single mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineage will remain.
No, that is not what this theory assumes at all. That's mostly just a matter of statistics. Just let a bunch of genetic lineages go on for long enough, and eventually you'll find that they all converge at some point. That's the Adam and Eve thing. Coalescent theory is more about constructing phylogenies for specific alleles. It allows us to map out genetic changes over time and construct phylogenies. There is so much more to coalescent theory than the question of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. If anything, they are mere byproducts of this theory as a whole.
Coalescence theory is based upon the assumption of random mating.
Well, coalescent theory is one of those theories where you can essentially choose how complex you want to get with it. So you can choose to ignore a bunch of variables in the process, but that's not necessarily the case. Now, I'm currently reading What If to my kids as their bedtime book. If you're unfamiliar, it is a fantastic book where former NASA roboticist Randall Munroe gives, to quote the subtitle of the book, serious scientific answers to absurd hypothetical questions. And one of the themes that I've seen repeated fairly regularly is the application of general principles in a way that's not going to actually be really accurate, but it'll be close enough for the purposes it's being used for. And coalescent theory can be used in this same way. You can dial in the precision so that rough estimates will be easier to arrive at, but will be rough, while more precise estimates can also be arrived at, but will require more precise calculations. Actually, come to think of it, pretty much any scientific field can be used that way. It's just more appropriate for some than others.
So you need a single population, and all the people have equal likelihood of intermarriage.
It's cute that you can't even seem to hint at the idea of children happening outside of marriage.
Marriage is what brings us together today.
I hate to break it to you, but on the grand scale of things, marriage is a relatively recent development. Monogamy may have existed in the past, but the idea of formalizing your monogamy ceremonially didn't really show up until about 4,300 years ago. But yeah, it does start with the assumption of random mating, which is not a correct assumption overall. Sexual selection is a thing, not to mention natural selection and genetic drift. This is one of those areas of science where simplifications can be used to get ballpark estimates that can be improved upon with further research.
That's never been the case. From an evolutionary point of view, humans and prehumans have always been in tribes that are separated. So there's not random mating. In fact, if you look at the charts that show coalescence, all you have to do is say, okay, that's one subpopulation, but there's dozens or hundreds of other subpopulations, and those would be producing a different coalescence to a different atom or a different Eve.
I mean, yeah? It all depends on how broad of a population we're talking about. Remember, coalescent theory is not specific to finding the mitochondrial or Y chromosome common ancestor, though these are certainly included under that umbrella. And remember last time when we talked about how if we expand our genetic analysis to include Neanderthal DNA, then we have a Y chromosome common ancestor with them as well? Yeah, the same principle is applying here. Also, remember how the time frame for the modern Homo sapien Y chromosome ancestor got pushed back when a previously unknown Y chromosome haplotype was discovered? That's this as well. The more you expand the group, the more distant the common ancestor for any particular allele will be. This is not surprising in the slightest. It's exactly how it works.
Basically, the coalescence argument fails.
Wait, hold on. How does it fail? Because it's a simplification? You think the researchers working on it are somehow unaware of the fact that it's a simplification? That's literally the first thing you learn about it when you start reading up on it. But yeah, that actually tracks for creationists. This very basic thing about science that is one of the first things you learn in this field doesn't carry forward perfectly in its oversimplified form when you learn more. Therefore, the whole field of study is wrong.
Evolutionary scientists reasoned that if humanity started with just 2 people, it could not explain the total amount of human diversity we see today.
Yeah, you've got that a bit backward. They didn't start with the 2 people thing. In fact, I doubt that even entered the equation anywhere. It's more that genetic analysis shows a few human bottleneck events, because bottleneck events show up in genetics. It creates a sudden loss of diversity in the genes, and the data shows that during these events, the population dropped to a few thousand people, possibly as few as 1,000, possibly as many as 20,000, more likely somewhere in the middle. So 10,000, that number that keeps coming up here, is probably a reasonable estimate. It's not that they looked at the idea of humanity having a single mating pair as their ancestor and decided in a post hoc fashion that that couldn't explain modern diversity. It's that modern diversity is best explained in light of a bottleneck event that had our population at about 10,000. And this bottleneck event, as mentioned earlier, is pretty much completely irrelevant when discussing our Y chromosome and mitochondrial common ancestors. The event likely took place about 70,000 years ago, which is more recent than either of them. It could definitely be related. Remember, who our common ancestor is for a particular genetic sequence depends on how many variations of that sequence survive in the population. So if an event culled a bunch of variations of the mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA, that could have caused several of those lineages to go extinct and therefore place our common ancestor for those lineages where we see them today. Had those bottlenecks not happened, though, those common ancestors would likely be even more distant in the past than they are now.
For this reason, a population of 10,000 became a central tenet of the current model.
Again, you have it backward. The data that we have access to today with modern genetics is best explained by a population of about 10,000 at the last bottleneck event. And this bottleneck event did not coincide with the existence of either the mitochondrial or Y chromosome common ancestor.
It's typically assumed that Adam and Eve would have had no genetic variance, no genetic diversity. However, there's no reason to assume they were created as nearly identical clones.
I mean, the process that the Bible describes has Eve made out of material harvested from Adam in a way that makes it look like God cloned Adam to make Eve, but it's not like the ancient Hebrews knew anything about genetics, so that mischaracterization is understandable. But yeah, in order for Adam and Eve to have contained all the potential diversity for future humans, genetics would have had to have worked in a way that they have never been observed to work in reality. So do you have any data to back up the idea that genetics work differently then than they do now? Or is that just a core assumption of creationism that can't be questioned?
If Adam and Eve were created with built-in diversity for traits such as skin color, all of the different-looking people groups could easily arise in a biblical time frame.
What does it mean to have built-in diversity? Well, what it would mean according to Stephen Schaffner, a computational biologist who has extensive experience working in human population genetics and is an author at BioLogos, an organization that is dedicated to harmonizing the Bible with science, he says that built-in diversity would mean that Adam's genome would have to have been significantly different from Eve's, basically about as different as it's possible for two human genomes to be. Now, geneticists would be able to distinguish between genetic variants that would have arisen through mutation and those that would have been originally created. If the variations were originally created, then those variations should be what are called high-frequency variants, variants that would be relatively common in the human genome, whereas variants that are the result of mutations would be rare variants or low-frequency variants. So if we map out the diversity pattern for high-frequency and low-frequency variants, we would expect them to be different. The low-frequency diversity pattern should match what is expected from mutational patterns that we see today, while the high-frequency diversity patterns should not. So when we map them out, what do we see? They are identical, which means that all of our variants have their origin in mutation. There's actually a lot more information that can be learned from studying this data, and it is all relevant, but suffice it to say for now that this data points to the fact that the human genome has been mutating for at least 1 million years, and that there was actually a long-term stable population size of about 15 to 20,000 individuals. This does not mean that the population was always this size, more like it averaged out to that over time, sometimes being larger, sometimes being smaller. Point is, no matter how we look at the data, we did not come from two individual humans 6,000 years ago. Or really 4,000 years ago if we're including Noah in there. And actually, that brings up an interesting point, because Noah's sons all had wives that were, presumably, not the daughters of Noah's wife. That would mean that if the Bible were true, our Y chromosome Adam would actually be Noah, while our mitochondrial Eve would still be Eve. Which really serves to illustrate the problem with using Adam and Eve as an analogy for our Y chromosome and mitochondrial common ancestors. Because even in the biblical comparison, if we start assuming that the Bible is true, it still would not have actually ended up with two individuals living simultaneously. Now, I'm skipping a huge chunk because they spend a whole lot of time just asserting that Adam and Eve had a high degree of heterozygosity. That is, they both carried multiple copies of the same genes all throughout their genome to produce the variation that we see in humans today, but they don't actually back it up with anything. It's all assertion, and as we have seen here, it's an assertion that's not backed up by the actual genetic data.
Prior to modern genetics, evolutionary scientists claimed that there were fundamentally different races of humans that evolved in diverse parts of the world over a long period of time. This model was known as the multi-regional hypothesis.
The multi-regional hypothesis began with the idea that several different species of humans should actually be classified as the same species, and modern humans evolved in, as you might guess from the title, multiple regions simultaneously. This is a minority position among geneticists, and its modern form is much weaker than that. Actually, remember before when I mentioned the fact that creationists love locking onto the Y chromosome Adam and the mitochondrial Eve because they think the science makes it look like humanity might have maybe originated from a single couple if you squint at the data just right, but they ignore other hypotheses with similarly biblical names like the weak Garden of Eden hypothesis, because even just a superficial glance at those ideas shows them to be quite contrary to any literal biblical interpretation? Well, the weaker version of the multi-regional hypothesis is the weak Garden of Eden hypothesis, the idea that groups of humans became genetically isolated from each other some 100,000 years ago or so, and then began expanding tens of thousands of years later. That is the weaker multi-regional hypothesis that still survives today.
This perception changed with the advent of DNA sequencing, which revealed that all human beings are remarkably similar genetically.
Yes, the weaker form of this hypothesis was developed when it was learned just how not genetically diverse humans really are. Even our close relatives, chimpanzees, have greater genetic diversity among individuals than humans do. So there's not enough diversity to support the idea that all these different hominid ancestors were actually the same species as us, so that idea was scrapped.
It is now well established among the scientific community that all people, regardless of their skin color or ethnicity, are 99.9% genetically identical. The so-called racial features that we tend to focus on are essentially only skin deep.
At last, a creationist position that I can agree with. The more you think about the concept of race in humans as compared to what would be a similar concept in the rest of the animals, the more ridiculous racial discrimination becomes. Often the comparison is made between human races and dog breeds, but when examined genetically, it becomes clear that human race is more of a social construct than anything else, and the physical differences are merely superficial. I'm not going to get into detail here, as that's not really what this video is about, but I do highly recommend reading through the study that I have linked in the description called Human Races Are Not Like Dog Breeds, Refuting a Racist Analogy. It's a fascinating examination of the genetic evidence, which ultimately concludes by likening what are perceived as racial differences as being more akin to hair color. That is, as stated, they are superficial. A human is a human is a human.
This means that regardless of our cultural differences, genetically, we are all part of one big human family.
And I'm sure you're about to use this to argue that because our diversity is so low, it could all have been contained within the genomes of just 2 individual people living 6,000 years ago. Now, I don't know enough about genetics to say whether or not that is a hypothetical possibility, but there are a myriad of reasons that we know for a fact that even if this is hypothetically possible, it was not the case. And not just from genetics. Name a field of science and I'll tell you how it disproves a young Earth creation. Now, sure, not all of them will specifically disprove the idea that all humans originated from one single human couple living in Mesopotamia. For that, you'll have to stick to biology, archaeology, paleontology, anthropology, and a few others. But any field of science will disprove a young Earth in one way or another.
If you have designed organisms, created organisms, they would be designed and created so they have internal diversity. You don't have to wait for mutations.
It's really odd to me how they swing back and forth so readily from talking about how not diverse humanity is as a whole, and then talking about how much amazing diversity can be packed into one individual's genome.
So the waiting time goes away. If you want adaptation without deep waiting time, then just design the organism with variants in it. Even a single organism has heterozygosity, and so there's lots of genetic diversity, even in a single organism. 2 individuals have 4 chromosome sets, and they have the ability to basically accommodate every possible variant.
Can you guys please at least nod to the fact that we're using relative terms here? Like, I get it, the argument is that humanity as a whole is not terribly genetically diverse when compared to most animals, and so given how much diversity can be contained in one person's genome, 2 people designed to maximize diversity could maybe have enough diversity to result in what we see today. I mean, as we saw from the very much Christian biologist Stephen Schaffner, we can tell the difference between a gene that would have originated through design versus mutation, and none of the genes show evidence of having originated through design, so this was almost certainly not the case unless God was just for whatever reason trying to hide the fact that he designed us from us, which really seems like an odd move if his goal is for us to actually believe that he did design us.
The findings from modern genetics have compelled evolutionary scientists to develop a revised story of human origins that shares many striking similarities with the biblical account of the Tower of Babel dispersion.
I guess, in the sense that humanity had its origin in a fairly small location on the planet and radiated outward from there. But aside from this very superficial similarity, there is nothing else that is the same about human origins and the Tower of Babel story. The location is wrong, the time frame is wrong, the bit about the languages is wrong. Everything about that story is wrong.
The new model is called the Out of Africa theory and has been popular for many years.
It took you this long just to get there, eh? It's always weird to me how creationists present science as starting with particular conclusions that they have to have in order to avoid creationism, and then desperately scrambling for new, non-creationist explanations when new data comes to light, as opposed to what really happens, which is that we collect the data and formulate our conclusions based on the data. And yes, sometimes we don't have enough data, and so the conclusions are incorrect. So when we find new data that causes us to need to correct the conclusion gets corrected. Fun fact, but most scientists aren't even considering how their work will impact young Earth creationism when they do their work. They just go where the data leads them. And yeah, sometimes scientists do get led astray by the data, whether that be because they have bad data, incomplete data, whether there's human error, or whatever else. But that happens because science is hard. Like, really hard. It takes a lot of work. What's not hard is misrepresenting science by picking at all these little spots where a change was required in an attempt to discredit essentially the entirety of science as a whole.
This theory proposes there was a near-extinction event causing a population bottleneck that reduced humanity to a single breeding population of just a few thousand survivors.
Oh, no, that's not the Out of Africa theory. That's the Toba catastrophe theory. These are two distinct ideas, though they are certainly connected. The genetic evidence shows that a population bottleneck for humanity happened sometime between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. The largest eruption of the Toba supervolcano happened about 70,000 years ago. That fits nicely into that range, and so it's thought to potentially be the cause of that bottleneck.
In the Out of Africa theory, which is now on the rocks, but in the Out of Africa theory, they postulated there was a human population of about 10,000 people for an indeterminate amount of time. They never really say how long it is, but let's say 10,000, 100,000 years. If we compare a modern species that has about that many individuals, you can look at the African cheetah. There's about 10,000 of them in the wild, give or take a few thousand, and they're having massive problems. Birth defects are increasing, reproductive incompatibility in couples is increasing, litter size is decreasing. All the population biologists are essentially assuming cheetahs are going to go extinct. How did Homo sapiens evolve?
Guys, come on. You are arguing that we originated from two separate bottleneck events, one where there were only 2 individuals and one where there were 8. That is significantly less than 10,000, and now here you are arguing that a population of 10,000 individuals is far too few to be a healthy breeding population. Pick a lane. Either a population of 2 is reasonable, and so a population of 10,000 would also be reasonable, or a population of 10,000 is far too few, and so a population of 2 would be just completely unthinkable. You can't have both. Well, unless you point out that cheetahs aren't human, so there might be genetic differences that could impact the population size that would be viable for maintaining a species, but in that case, there wouldn't be any point in bringing cheetahs up in the first place because they wouldn't be analogous.
We supposedly went from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. Homo erectus is smashing rocks together, and Homo sapiens that can fly to the moon.
The abilities of modern humans after thousands of years of scientific advancement should not be compared to the abilities of an ancient and extinct human species that didn't survive long enough to develop any research techniques of their own. Modern humans did coexist with Homo erectus for a while, and while we did, our level of technology was roughly equivalent. So if you want a more accurate comparison of abilities, Homo erectus were banging rocks together, while Homo sapiens were also banging rocks together.
The out-of-Africa theory claims all living humans originated from this small population who lived in the general vicinity of northeast Africa. Alternative studies suggest this small founding population was a little further north, in the general vicinity of the Middle East.
By alternative studies here, what he means is this one study by the very guy we've been interviewing through this entire video, who has shown himself to have no problem cherry-picking and misrepresenting data, and which was published in an explicitly creationist journal. Forgive me for not taking that at its word. Maybe find something that's published in a less obviously biased journal?
The survivors of this theoretical near-extinction event suddenly grew very rapidly, splitting into numerous smaller tribes which dispersed outward and gradually filled Europe, Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas.
And again, the time frame on this does not match with the biblical time frame at all. The evidence puts the first humans to arrive in North America doing so between 15 and 20,000 years ago, some 9 to 14,000 years before the universe began, according to creationists. Same goes for pretty much everywhere we found ancient human remains.
Each initial tribe gave rise to its own language and culture, and continued to split and disperse to form the people groups and languages we see today.
And actually, much like biological evolution, we can trace linguistic evolution through geography as well. And language is actually a really easy-to-grasp analogy for biological evolution. Creationists will often have a hard time picturing the transition between an ancestral species and its modern descendants, wondering when the monkey gave birth to a human or something similarly absurd. Language can help us imagine how this can happen gradually over time. I speak the same language as my kids, English. But they tend to use certain slang and phrases that seem foreign to people of my generation. And this is a fairly universal experience. Every generation uses the language slightly differently from the parent generation, but it remains the same language. When regional separation occurs, the various regions will develop their version of the language slightly differently from one another, and so regional dialects are born.
Then at least speak English.
All right, my son. I could have had it away with this cracking Judy, my old China.
Are you telling pork pies in a bag of trout? Because if you are feeling quickly, why not just have a J. Arthur?
What, Billy no, mates?
Too right, youth.
Don't you remember the Crimbo Din Din we had with the grotty Scotchman?
Oh, the one that was all 6s and 7s.
Yeah, she was a trouble and strife, but the Morris dancer lived up the apples and pears.
Yeah, she was the barrister that became a bobby in a lorry, and they gave her the Gatling gun in the bottom of St. Regis tea kettle. Yes,
and then
she shat on a turtle.
As the regions get farther apart and become more and more isolated from each other, completely new languages develop, and that's how we ended up with the Romance languages like French, Spanish, and Italian all evolving from Latin, or the Germanic languages evolving from the Proto-Germanic language, etc. Of course, the analogy breaks down a bit when we come to realize that bastard languages like English exist, which is technically a Germanic language, but borrows heavily from French and notoriously just takes whatever grammatical rules it can get its hands on and uses them pretty much completely arbitrarily. If language and evolution were really perfectly analogous, then English would be the crocoduck that is sought after by creationists. English is the crocoduck of languages. Anywho, the languages show a pattern of evolution, not spontaneous creation, and so they don't really fit in with the Tower of Babel story.
Evolutionary geneticists reporting in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences have named this specific model the instantaneous divergence model.
Okay, I did skip a bit, but they were just going over a summary of the Tower of Babel story. Well, summary might be the wrong word to use. Generally, a summary would be shorter than the original, not longer, but that's beside the point. The instantaneous divergence model is not a scientific model of how the Tower of Babel worked. All throughout the paper, they explain how the data shows that humans originated in Africa, and while this paper is very statistics-heavy, which is not my best area, so there's a good chance that I'm misunderstanding it, it seems that the instantaneous divergence model is essentially meant to be a useful oversimplification. To quote the paper, this model, which itself is implausible as a description of human migrations, can help illuminate the features of the serial founder model that allow it to explain the observed patterns. In other words, it's a useful tool for helping us come to a better understanding of the actual accepted model, but it is not itself an accurate model.
This model is virtually indistinguishable from the biblical model of the human dispersion associated with the Tower of Babel, as recorded in Genesis chapter 11.
Maybe in the sense that it's completely implausible, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. It's a simplification of a different model that is meant to avoid the difficulty in modeling population bottlenecks. And also worth mentioning is that this model relies on a lot of data and assumptions from other models in order to be useful, other models that explicitly contradict the biblical account. It begins by assuming the accuracy of these other models, so no matter how you slice it, this one doesn't fit with the Bible.
One of the funny things about the out of Africa theory is that it actually mirrors the biblical account.
Not really. The way evolution works, a species will pretty much always evolve in a fairly small geographic region, and if that species is successful, it will spread out from that region. The fact that humanity started out in a fairly small geographic region and spread out from there over time is a byproduct of the fact that the human species evolved. And this is the only detail that lines up in any way with the biblical story. And it doesn't even line up well. It's just a very general pattern of movement. It doesn't even get the geographic region right. Okay, that's it for this one. We're all done with this series now. The rest of their video is just a summary. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Matthew Heinlein, who says, "The worst explanation for Foucault's pendulum I have ever heard. More accurate to say that it was actually just false." Well, Matthew, if that's the case, I would actually love to correct my understanding of how they work. I am fully open to the idea that I misunderstood my source. Pendulums aren't something I cover frequently, so it's entirely possible that I misinterpreted something fairly simple. The problem is, just shouting "you're wrong" into the void without providing any meaningful correction doesn't accomplish anything. Can you explain it better? Was my source in error? Can you provide a better source? If I'm wrong, I honestly want to know, but just commenting that I am wrong is unhelpful without any more detail. This video has been brought to you by the Bart Ehrman vs. Mike Licona debate happening on April 9th. When you register for the debate, you get access to the full-day debate, where they will be discussing such topics as the proof for the early witnesses to the resurrection, the plausibility of the resurrection being a late fabrication, the trustworthiness of the gospel accounts, and much, much more. You will also get lifetime access to the recording, so if you can't watch it all in one go, you can save it for later and watch it at your own pace, and you will always be able to refer back to it. Visit vicerhino.com/Bart to register now. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, iOS Tilt Bill Gamer, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, and all the rest, who are the Foucault pendulum demonstrating the rotation of my channel. If you'd like me to completely misunderstand you to the point of being completely and utterly wrong, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!